Mark Wahlberg stood behind the curtain, hands in his jacket pockets, listening. The studio was already in rhythm. He could hear the drums of laughter, the clinks of glasses between crew members, the hum of applause signs clicking on and off like background noise in a room built to control its own sound. Stephen Colbert's voice filled the space, sharp and polished. Up next, a Boston legend, an action star, a protein powder with abs, and probably the only guy who can bench press Catholic guilt. Laughter. It rolled like a wave, exactly as designed. Please welcome Mark Wahlberg. Mark stepped through the curtain. He didn't wave. He didn't smirk. He walked the way he always had, like a man who's moved through rooms that didn't start out in his favor. He shook Stephen's hand. Once. Firm. Then took his seat. Stephen smiled wide, leaned back in his chair with practiced ease. Man, you clean up well. Mark nodded. So do you. Laughter again, but smaller. Polite. Stephen continued. Let's get into it. You're back with another movie. This one's got action, redemption, maybe even a few tears. Sounds like you took a look in the mirror and wrote a script. More laughter. Mark didn't smile. Maybe I just wanted to tell a story without apologizing for the people in it. Stephen raised an eyebrow. Is that a hint? Or a warning? Mark looked at him directly. It's just a line. The kind that doesn't come with a punchline attached. The laughter didn't pick up that time. Stephen noticed. So did Mark. Stephen pushed forward. You've always been a straight shooter, which is refreshing. Sometimes confusing, but always intense. Mark shrugged. Better to be misunderstood than empty. That line didn't get laughs either, but it got quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind that didn't fit the room's rhythm. Stephen leaned in. Let me ask you this. Do you ever worry that being serious in a world built for sarcasm makes you look out of step? Mark held his gaze. Only when the sarcasm starts replacing the truth. Stephen nodded slowly. You know this is a comedy show, right? Mark nodded back. Then maybe we need a little more discomfort in comedy. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They just sat there, waiting. Because somehow, they could already feel it. This wasn't going to be the kind of interview that fit between commercial breaks. Stephen Colbert smiled and leaned back. Not out of comfort, out of instinct. When the tone breaks, go funny. When the rhythm slips, go fast. When the guest won't give you the segment, give them the illusion of one. You know, Mark, I don't get nervous often, but when someone talks about truth on a comedy show, I start reaching for the fire extinguisher. Laughter. Polite. Measured. Tight. Mark Wahlberg didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. Maybe you should reach for a mirror instead. There wasn't laughter after that. Just the soft hush of a room that hadn't decided yet what to do with that sentence. Stephen straightened slightly. So is that the theme today? No jokes. No charm. Just hard truths and harder stares. Mark looked at him. You invited me. I showed up. You assumed I'd play the part. I didn't. The crowd shifted. They weren't clapping. They weren't booing. But they were listening. And more importantly, they weren't laughing anymore. Stephen pressed on. Okay. So you're the serious guy now. The honest guy. Fine. But are you really going to tell me that entertainment doesn't need levity? That audiences want lectures? Mark shook his head. They want something real. And they can tell the difference. Even when it comes wrapped in applause. The applause sign didn't light up. Because the crew didn't hit it. Because they didn't know if the audience was supposed to clap for that. Stephen crossed one leg over the other. His voice cool again. Almost too cool. I don't think people came here tonight to be uncomfortable. Mark responded softly. Maybe that's why they should have. Stephen raised both hands. Mock defense. Okay. You win. You've out-serioused me. Mark looked at him with a kind of calm that didn't need permission. It's not about winning. It's about not pretending. The crowd murmured. Not against him. Just reacting. The way people react when something didn't go how they were told it would, and yet still feels exactly right. Stephen glanced at the clock off stage. He smiled, but it didn't land the same. Well, Mark Wahlberg, ladies and gentlemen, here to make us all feel deeply, uncomfortably seen. Laughter. Smaller now. More self-aware. Mark said nothing. He just sat there, exactly as he had when he entered. Unmoved. Unperformed. Still. Stephen Colbert tapped his cue cards against the desk. Twice. It wasn't impatience. It was recalibration. The audience was quiet now, not tense, just waiting. Waiting for him to steer it back. Waiting for Mark to give in. Waiting for someone to make this feel like late night again. Stephen smiled tightly. Let's try a different lane. You've done faith-based films. Redemption arcs. That whole man with a past, man on a path genre. But be honest, do you ever think maybe you're preaching to people who just wanted popcorn? Laughter. Scattered. Obligatory. Mark Wahlberg didn't laugh. He looked down at the desk for the first time. Then up. You want honesty? Stephen raised his eyebrows. That's what we sell. Mark nodded once. Then here's a story you won't put in the monologue. The room quieted. Fully now. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Mark leaned forward. Elbows on knees. No act. No rhythm. Just truth. 5 years ago, I visited a juvenile detention center in Massachusetts. Not for press. No cameras. Just a visit. I sat with 6 kids. All under 18. Every one of them in for something they couldn't undo. Stephen sat still. The audience leaned in. Mark continued. One of them, David. He looked at me and said, I know what you used to be. So what made you change? A pause. I told him I stopped asking to be forgiven and started acting like I already was. That's it. No script. No scene. Just a decision. No one spoke. Stephen didn't reach for a quip, because there wasn't one. Mark leaned back. His voice quiet now. Sometimes people don't need a joke. They need to know you meant what you became. The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was earned. Even the band didn't fill it. Stephen finally spoke. His voice softer than before. That wasn't in the notes. Mark smiled. Not big, not performative. Just enough to acknowledge something had landed. That's because real moments never are. The audience didn't clap. They just stayed still. Because no one wanted to be the first to move away from it. Rajeshem. Stephen Colbert looked down at his cue cards. Then set them aside. No joke. No wrap-up. Just a glance toward the floor director and a subtle nod. The red recording light above camera too dimmed. The segment hadn't run long. But the moment had run full. Mark Wahlberg sat quietly. No need to move. He wasn't waiting for applause. He wasn't waiting to be released. He just stayed, as if to say, I didn't come here to finish a segment. I came here not to be edited. Stephen cleared his throat once. Well, Mark Wahlberg, everybody. It wasn't a send-off. It was surrender. Not to Mark. To the moment. The audience clapped, but only because they were invited. Not because they were ready. Not because the story needed it. Stephen reached across the desk and shook Mark's hand. This time, firmer. Not for show. For grounding. Backstage, the segment producer leaned into the control room mic. We're skipping the second card. Tell post. No edits. The director didn't ask why. He just answered. Understood. Outside the studio, a staffer held the cue sheet with the rest of the night's show rundown. She crossed out 2 follow-up jokes Stephen never delivered, then circled one line in her margin notes. Let it land. That's what Mark had done. He let it land. Not by performing it. By living it. By refusing to make it entertaining. Stephen didn't return to his usual rhythm for the rest of the show. The next guest came on. The laughs returned. But something in the tempo stayed slower. Because the audience had felt something real, and they weren't ready to be distracted from it. Rajeshem. Stephen Colbert looked down at his cue cards. Then set them aside. No joke. No wrap-up. Just a glance toward the floor director and a subtle nod. The red recording light above camera too dimmed. The segment hadn't run long. But the moment had run full. Mark Wahlberg sat quietly. No need to move. He wasn't waiting for applause. He wasn't waiting to be released. He just stayed, as if to say, I didn't come here to finish a segment. I came here not to be edited. Stephen cleared his throat once. Well, Mark Wahlberg, everybody. It wasn't a send-off. It was surrender. Not to Mark. To the moment. The audience clapped, but only because they were invited. Not because they were ready. Not because the story needed it. Stephen reached across the desk and shook Mark's hand. This time, firmer. Not for show. For grounding. Backstage, the segment producer leaned into the control room mic. We're skipping the second card. Tell post. No edits. The director didn't ask why. He just answered. Understood. Outside the studio, a staffer held the cue sheet with the rest of the night's show rundown. She crossed out 2 follow-up jokes Stephen never delivered, then circled 1 line in her margin notes. Let it land. That's what Mark had done. He let it land. Not by performing it, by living it, by refusing to make it entertaining. Stephen didn't return to his usual rhythm for the rest of the show. The next guest came on. The laughs returned. But something in the tempo stayed slower. Because the audience had felt something real, and they weren't ready to be distracted from it. Rajeshem. 3 weeks later, the show's rhythm returned. Stephen Colbert's desk filled again with index cards and punchlines. The audience laughed again. The band played. The applause signs worked. No one mentioned the segment. But no one had forgotten it. It hadn't gone viral. It hadn't been quoted on late-night recaps. It hadn't trended. But it stayed. In inboxes. In classrooms. In moments where someone tried to explain the difference between being right and being real. Mark Wahlberg didn't resurface. Didn't build a tour around it. Didn't pitch it as a message. Didn't package the moment. When asked again, quietly, off camera, about how it felt, he answered. It felt honest. That's enough. And that's why it stayed. Because it wasn't delivered. It was lived. And that kind of thing doesn't go away. It just settles somewhere deeper than noise. In a media theory class at a Midwestern college, the professor played the segment. Then said nothing. The room didn't either. At the end of the hour, a student wrote 1 sentence at the bottom of their notes. Truth doesn't interrupt. It outlasts. Back at the studio, the cue cards from that night were never reprinted. They were stored in a small envelope labeled Mark W. No one touched it. Because you don't edit something that ended itself. Stephen never commented. Not because he was afraid to. Because he understood what had happened. He hadn't lost control. He'd been shown something he didn't expect to find, and he'd let it happen. And the audience? They came back. But slower. Not because they'd turned. Because now they remembered what a room felt like when nothing was expected, but everything was real. Mark Wahlberg had said 1 sentence they didn't know how to market. Sometimes people don't need a joke. They need to know you meant what you became. And somehow that was enough. Because the moment didn't need to be retold. It had already been lived. And some moments don't echo because they were loud. They echo because they didn't ask to.